Once again, brothers, we are back here with Stephen Lee and Jorge Mendoza. Again, just always a pleasure to be with you, brothers.
What's up, everybody?
Yeah, hey.
We're here.
He's just,
Strength of 12 horses. No, not horses.
Horsepower.
The strength of 12 men, his last name.
The strength. I love that idea of strength.
The strength of last
when we talk about strength,
Yeah.
the strength of, you're just changing it up, but it's like the strength.
I like 12 horses.
12 horses, like horsepower.
Just change your brother's name up.
Yeah.
That's what happens.
Well, they did that in Cali anyway.
Yeah, they do. He's used to it. He's used to
You're
it.
no
So,
longer Jorge, you're George. Yeah.
You know what's interesting, because that's what, these first two topics when we talk about being reconciled or being an advocate versus agitator. What's interesting about that is the first two R's many times could be perceived as weak. The first R was talking about the idea of relying heavily on the power of Christ through prayer.
Yeah.
And the second one is talking about requires the full acknowledgement of God's grace. Prayer and grace are not strong terms.
Yeah. Right.
That you can't go to a rally. Grace, grace. Like people are not going to embrace and embody that. So we talk about the strength of 12
Talk about
men.
justice.
Talk
about justice,
but not grace. Grace, you see what I'm saying? And so that's an interesting thing. As man, and you can feel like you're a punk.
Yeah, it's kind of weak.
Yeah, you weak.
Yeah,
soft.
Yeah,
like you're somebody's doormat.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And that's a lot of the tension that we face.
And that's kind of, you see even in this generation of activism, one of the comments saying, this ain't your mama's civil rights movement.
Yeah.
And said, we're not going to take that route. We're actually going to muscle. We're going to enforce. We're going to press.
Yeah, as if like the civil rights movement didn't know that there was another way to do it.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that's what's funny, because like if you realize Malcolm X was also there.
Yeah.
There was also kind of take up your rights. The Black Panther Party, there was a lot of people who were taking up arms, more militant.
Yeah.
And so people act like they came up with something new. Like there's always been this kind of vengeance.
Yeah. Right.
I'll take vengeance in my own hands.
And not only has it been new, that's been the modus operandi. That's been the way it's been done.
Yeah.
Whoever has the most power is going to get it. So
Yeah. And so prayer and grace
doesn't fit that.
Don't fit that.
It doesn't.
And but it's interesting that in the letter, Paul reverts back to as his primary strength at both prayer and dependence on grace. This one comes from verse 6 in the book of Philemon. Okay. It says, I pray that your participation in the faith may become effective through knowing every good thing that is in us for the glory of Christ. Right? So we're talking about being an advocate versus an agitator. And again, just a reminder, an advocate is a person who proactively and publicly pleads on someone else's behalf. So we're talking about proactivity, but we're starting off with prayer and grace, which doesn't seem like we talked about not being very proactive. But last year we saw prayer is a very proactive thing. And now we're talking about dealing with people with grace. But it says, but what I love about this passage, it talks about he's praying for your participation in the faith that may become effective through knowing every good thing that is in you for the glory of God. So it's talking about this idea of full knowledge of the God's grace. And when I think about the full knowledge of God's grace, it's both from a intellectual understanding, but it's also from an experiential one as well. I think in evangelical circles in our churches that we're really good on the intellectual side, but don't let someone wrong you. Don't let my spouse cheat on me. Don't let something that is worth an offense happen. Grace goes out the window.
We don't. Jesus told 7 times 70, but we're like, fool me once.
Shame on me.
Fool me twice.
Shame on you.
2, you get 2.
That's it. That's it. I mean, and that's the kind of the MO, the model that we live on. It's just kind of like, nah, I'm not going to be perceived as weak. Or a doormat.
No, I often think sometimes I'm a glutton for punishment, man. I'll sign on, my Facebook, and just sometimes kind of see the feeds in the conversations, whether it's Republican, Democrat, whether it's people live in the East Coast or people that live in the South, and at times just kind of see just kind of the adversarial nature, even of people in the church. I think one of the things that I think has been just so shocking, whether it's the election that we just saw in our country or social injustice, is a lot of times just to see how people within the church, people that claim the name of Christ, that we're all blood-bought believers, that it's very difficult for us to extend grace to one another. Even I think you talked about in your sermon, man, which I loved, for Democrats that are, or Christians that are Democrats, to be able to understand, to empathize why people in perhaps their community might vote Republican. But a lot of times, bro, that's just that conversation doesn't happen. Whether it's at, especially sometimes in African American, like in my family, there's no discussion of where you vote. It's literally, it's assumed. It's just kind of, but I think, like you said, I think the nature of grace, it's so countercultural, and it so runs against the norm of how we typically want to act and to behave. And I think it's something that
and it's not even popular. It's not even popular. Like if I were to go in and say give grace to both Trump and Hillary supporters and give that across the board to one another, I would be perceived as weak, as not doing anything. Even though it's very biblical, to give grace.
I think it's in there a few times.
But that is the thing that we have, and I think a lot of times, it's specifically, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it, as minorities, that a lot of times we don't check ourselves when it comes to this types of things, because we come from a posture of justice, and we'll talk about that, but we come from this posture, and so as other minorities, we don't want to check one another, and and then the white culture is not going to check us, because then you're going to be seen as a racist, and so but this idea of leading out with grace is foreign. So I mean, please push back, give me some tension, because I want to be able to properly see this, but I see that, this is one of the major issues of what we're talking about, the difference between being an advocate and an agitator. Right. What I see a lot going out there with some of our peers, people that we know are more agitation than advocates, and it's like, we just want to stir up the pot. They're not giving solutions. They're not giving anything. They're not giving grace. So we'll intellectually teach about grace, but when we need to kind of engage in that grace, there it is. And I know we're not giving a certain subject matter, a certain topic. I'm just speaking in broad strokes, but you know what I'm.
Yeah, I think I love how you put the difference between agitator and advocate. I've thought about it in terms of revolutionary versus redemptionaries. Revolutionaries just want to change things. A lot of times, and rightly so, for the sake of changing things. Obviously, we live in a broken world with broken systems. Things go wrong. So there definitely needs to be areas that need to be addressed and be changed and be confronted. But redemptionaries look at it and say, how can these things be changed in a way that's going to further advance the well-being of all people, and then particularly the advance of the gospel and the kingdom, and how can we represent from that angle? So it's not just acting, even though we ought to act, but it's acting with the ultimate purpose in mind of what we believe Christ wants to see accomplished in His world. And this is not just proving people wrong and getting them to admit that they were wrong, but beyond that, wrong things have been done, but how do we now come together? I just recently we're talking about the Dakota Pipeline a while back, a picture of a chief, an indigenous chief, sitting on a chair, and about 8 to 12 U.S. military representatives on their knees asking forgiveness for the atrocities committed to the indigenous people of the Americas by U.S. military government in particular. And just the picture itself is a powerful picture. And that's what we want to aim for. Not just that, they were wrong, and even to admit that they were wrong, but that picture of forgiveness and seeking forgiveness and reconciliation. Because once we get past the justice question, we still have to know how to live with one another. And that's what we want to get towards ultimately.
I think that's a great thing to even look at, that picture, of it. What if you, like, I don't know if this is overshot, but Jorge, maybe you can even answer. Would you call using your redemptionary and revolutionary? Would you say that Malcolm X was a revolutionary and Martin Luther King was a redemptionary? I mean, I don't know if we can play with that.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not as familiar with X as I probably am with King.
And the reason why I asked that question is primarily it's really about the Malcolm X popularized or coined the phrase "by any means necessary." Yeah. And I think that a lot of times when you're one experiencing injustice, we kind of take up those arms and we feel like we can say "by any means necessary."
Yes, and that I would say so, because I would say we are redemptionaries because we don't take up arms; we lay down our lives, and because it's easy to picket, it's easy to protest. And that's more of an active, vocal, make a presence. But it's harder to lay your life down in a particular community for the long haul. There's nobody's looking, nobody's watching. The news is not really they care that you're 20 years in a school system to try to reform and try to make it better for the people there that they can advance. So yeah, it's a less glorious and a less visible, but I do think the analogy does go to a certain extent.
So what are those boundaries? Because a lot of times if it was by any means necessary, and if we're saying that that's not wrong, or that's wrong, then if we're saying that we all want reconciliation in a sense or change, but I would say for the believer, it's by all possible means, right? So instead of by any means necessary, it's by all possible means. That gives us the boundary of Christianity, and we talked about this idea that the goal of Christianity is reconciliation. It's not justice. And I've said before is that you can have justice without reconciliation, right? But you can't have true reconciliation without justice. Justice without reconciliation is what the Bible calls hell, right? Because God will be justified, at the Bema seat. But the question becomes, those who are not reconciled to his son, Jesus, will spend eternally apart from him in hell. So that's not the goal of Christianity. The goal of Christianity is reconciliation. So if that's the end game, that means it can't be by any means necessary. It's about by all possible means. And so what are those boundaries, in which we have? Can we take on the revolutionary hat, and just only seek justice? And are we being authentically Christian if we only take up the revolutionary hat and don't acknowledge the redemptionary one?
Wow, that's a good question. Man, I've often, thought just, in my life personally, but then in people that I've interacted with, that I think the challenge sometimes that we face is realizing how bad things were in Genesis 3. I mean, just kind of all of the chaos that took place as a result of Adam and Eve's sin, disobeying God, and the chaos that took place, obviously between God and man, but then really the enmity and the hatred and the distrust between human beings. And so I think the important thing, the reason that we've started, with prayer and grace. So because I think important is that grace is a biblical characteristic. Like it's what informs the gospel narrative. I mean, for God to send his son to the world means that human beings have an opportunity to not receive what they deserve. And I find so much in our heart, in our life, in our churches, is that the way that we seek to interact with people, especially that are different than us, it's not informed by that narrative. And so we leave that narrative. We kind of forget about really the kind of the topic of what we deserve in terms of whether it's our behavior, in terms of our thought life. And we kind of leave that bounds and we say, look, that's church stuff. What this person deserves for this is my full wrath or the full wrath of God. And so I think that's one thing. It's not a holistic gospel. And I think that's the challenge. I think the place where we want to be as bridge builders, I think that's the challenge sometimes of being bridge builders, is that people don't always understand why we have these conversations. Just you do your black thing, you do your white thing, you do your Hispanic thing, we'll all meet together in heaven. And that sometimes is it would be the easier route, to be very honest. I mean, to not be bridge builders. And so I think those are some of the things as we kind of think through what should we do, what shouldn't we do, what are the boundaries. I think those things have to be informed by the gospel, Christ, the gospel narrative. As we go forward.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting is about, looking back at history and even the founding of our country that, they established laws and principles and things that we need to be governed by. But I've been reading about presidential pardons, and I was looking into the history of the presidential pardon. And the reason that the presidential pardon exists was, our man Alexander Hamilton, he's the one that advocated for it and argued that it should be there. But his reasoning was that there would be times in our country. Remember, they're in the middle of a revolution themselves. Yeah. So there will be times in our country of other revolutions and rebellions and seditions that when they get suppressed, the right thing would be to forgive and pardon the leaders of those rebellions for the sake of harmony and moving on the future.
Okay.
So they even recognize like justice isn't the only thing we need.
That's good.
To rectify the situation, but beyond that, once we all kind of get to where we need to, they also recognize that there are going to be seasons of where we need to extend full forgiveness to the offenders against our country for the sake of being able to move on as a country.
Yeah. But I mean, I see the pushback a lot of times will be, we can forgive certain things, but there are certain things that we can't forgive. And again, it goes back to kind of an intellectual thing that we understand, because I'm in full agreement with you, but it's kind of like to a point. Like we all have that to a point, that I'm able to do that. And we don't fully embrace, and that all of a sudden we've lost the sense of total depravity, right? And so it's just like, I can't deal with all your depravity, but I can deal with partial depravity, and it's just like, and so we don't embrace. And, I was just even looking up the song Amazing Grace in the stanza, where it says, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. And I think that picture of grace is a powerful picture that we all want to embrace, that we don't want God to deal with his justice, in the way in dealing with us. And it's a beautiful sound. So intellectually it's good, but when we are called to demonstrate that grace to others, it's like, man, hold up. We only got so much.
we want grace for us and justice for everybody else.
Yes.
Because as someone said, my sins are never so vile as when you commit them.
That's good. That's good. And so, I mean, I think that is it. And so, I mean, really it's this, in these first two things that we got to recognize, man, that prayer and grace is actual shows kind of not our strength, but it's the strength of Christ. That we're only able to give people grace because we have received it. We have experienced it. And so that's what Paul is saying, is that you who have experienced pardon, you who have experienced grace, you who have experienced mercy, you should be able to give this mercy to Onesimus, right? Even though you're justified,
and giving him
what he deserves. Give him mercy, because the heart is reconciliation.
Yeah, and that's the thing about people that have really experienced the gospel here. Those of us who have been fully and freely forgiven by the Lord Jesus Christ and are called upon to exercise that same kind of love and grace towards others, we can never say, I don't even know where to begin. I don't even know what that looks like. That excuse has been ripped out of our mouths, because we've been treated like that. We've been on the receiving end of that kind of mercy and grace.
Yeah. Well, man, as we close, man, I thought just a little bit. I wanted to ask Tahati. We've talked a lot about, man, just kind of grace. I mean, grace being something that we see just throughout Scripture. I mean, I think one of the things that you've often talked about, which I've learned, is that it's hard to give grace to people that you're not in close proximity with, that you don't have a relationship with, because in some sense you're embracing a character of that particular person. We have people listen on our podcast to say, look, man, I agree with all the things you guys are saying, but what are some practical steps that I can take to see this kind of more fleshed out in my day-to-day life, for my neighbor, for the person who's across the street that doesn't vote the way that I do, that doesn't look the way that I do, is economically in a different place? Like, what are some steps that you would recommend?
I think what you just talked about was the idea that one, relationship and proximity is huge. But I think in the way we engage in some practical principles that I constantly go through in my mind is an acronym that I use that I feel like was extracted from Matthew with the golden rule, where he talks about treat others in the way you want to be treated, right? Because in there's a both quantitative and qualitative value in there. One, in order to treat others the way you want to be treated, you got to first know how you want to be treated, right? And so that's kind of the R. The first thing is that you got to reflect personally, right? If I was in this situation, if this was going down, I got to reflect on personally how I would want to be. But then you got to treat others in that way. So the second one is empathize corporately. I want to bring the same empathy to that brother or that sister that has either offended me or that has wronged or wherever the tension lies. So I want to reflect personally. I want to empathize corporately. And then the third one is pursue reconciliation. All right, and then it goes on, it says the path is wide, narrow versus wide. And so pursuing the mind of Christ or pursuing reconciliation is the idea is putting on the mind of Christ, and that we got to recognize that God has given us the ministry of reconciliation. So if we think about going to our neighbors or those people who are different than us, go hear their story, because there's a reason why. There's a worldview. There's a story behind why they believe or think the way that they think. But understand that you also haven't arrived and have this kind of, but just really understand that you also are coming from a position and a posture. And there's things in your life that has influenced that. So in that, and then once we get that we have to both commit, specifically as an advocate versus an agitator, we got to permit to pursuing the mind of Christ, pursuing reconciliation, pursuing righteousness, right, standing with God. So, so man, thanks again. And again, I just really want to really emphasize these first two are critical, and as we start getting into running to the tension of injustice and all those things, if we don't lay that foundation of both prayer and grace, then the stuff that we're going to do is going to end up doing more harm than hurt.
That's a good word.
So, then good. So,
we out.
So, thank you guys. Appreciate you.
All right. See you soon.